Hi, everyone. I'm here trying to record this lecture and trying to be very still so that I don't hurt my back. This is the lecture that we would have had on Monday on early Mexican American history from 1910 to 1929. So the key themes of this time period are Mexican labor and workers' movements, experiences of Mexican Americans in the Southwest with increasing immigration as a result of the Mexican Revolution, and of course, World War I. For Mexican labor, the chapter focused a lot on different experiences that Mexicans had as laborers and how they were needed in the US during this time period for their labor. But we also saw some of the experiences that they had in terms of discrimination, being paid less than white workers, which meant that they were often used as a way to hold down wages, break strikes, and weaken unions through what became called the Mexican scale of pay. They were excluded from many of the mainstream unions, like the American Federation of Labor. I didn't allow them to join or allow them only in marginal affiliates. The more radical international workers of the world, also known as the Wobblies, filled the unionizing gap left by the American Federation of Labor and sought to unionize Mexican laborers, but they were really one of the only unions of this time period that were willing to unionize Mexican workers. The reading talks about a number of different strikes that happened during this time period. One example is the Wheatland strike of 1913, which brought together workers across racial ethnic groups to strike in favor of better living wages. Although this again was through the International Workers of the World, but their strategies of being more confrontational in their strikes often led to violence with a number of casualties. But the Wheatland strike, one of its unique aspects of this time period was that it was the largest farm worker strike to take place in California at this time. So we often hear about the farm worker movement from Cesar Chavez and that particular time period. But what we see in the history is that farm workers had been organizing from very early on, and this Wheatland strike is one example. Among the strikes that was talked about was the various miners' strikes. This mining was a very dangerous kind of work. And we see them throughout New Mexico, Arizona, and Colorado, where mining is a large source of work for Mexican workers. The reading shared in detail, however, the dangerous conditions in which they worked and lived, earning very little income, not enough wages to support their families. We also see the danger in terms of Mexican workers dying from explosions that take place. One example was the New Mexico mine explosion, where 230 workers died. Now, one of the most famous mining strikes took place here in Colorado was the Lolo Massacre of 1914, which you may have heard about before, but typically the Lolo Massacre gets talked about and in reference to predominantly white workers, and rarely is it mentioned that Mexican American workers were there as well. Now, this massacre takes place in 1914 as a response to striking miners. The National Guard was sent into Trinidad, Colorado, to the tent colony created by the workers when they had been evicted from the coal mining company's land. 20 miners, 2 women, and 12 children were killed. And among those dead were Mexican Americans, including Elvira Valdez, a 3-month-old baby. The Colorado National Guard was sent there to protect the interests of the mine owners, not the miners. Violence continued between miners and the mine owners in the area as a result of the loss of women and children in Lolo. The violence didn't end until Woodrow Wilson The president at the time intervened, sending federal troops that disarmed both sides, ending the conflict. So for about a 14-month time period in this area, it was basically like a civil war between the miners and the mine company owners who were backed by local police force and the Colorado National Guard. And this is a quote from someone who has memories of being there. From another Latina, Jen Torres. My grandmother was firmly convinced that the problems in the law would be ended as soon as the government came to the miners' rescue. When the state militia opened fire on the colony, she never fully recovered from the shock. So it's not just about the dead, but also the many who survived, but have had to live with the trauma of that experience. And here in the image, what you see is what's left of the 10th colony after they're attacked, not just by rifle fire, but also they set tents on fire. And this is really what caused many of the deaths that did happen. So the Lolo massacre is something that is often talked about in history books, but again, rarely is it mentioned that Mexican Americans were among those that were part of the strike, but also part of the casualties of the massacre itself. Now, the reading also talked about some of the violence that we see happening, particularly in Texas. And some of this comes from the rise of the Mexican bandit, sort of the Mexican bandit as an idea of about Mexican men in particular. This is one example of the kinds of posters that would be put out. This one is specifically about Joaquin Murrieta, which the reading talked about, who was one of the people who went to California to pan for gold in the 1850s. Now, of course, as the reading talked about, there were numerous different stories about who Joaquin Murrieta was, partly because there were quite a number of men in the time period who were named Joaquin. And so they all kind of became blurred together into one person, Joaquin Murrieta. And part of the reason is because there are these group of Mexican men who, out of anger from the discrimination, the violence that they and their families and their communities are experiencing, start to retaliate against Anglos and Anglo ranchers and so on, mostly causing vandalism on Anglo property. So there's different stories as to how his particular life of thievery began. Some say he sought revenge after Anglos trampled onto his gold claim in California, killed his father, brother, and drove his mother out of their land. But as I said, there were multiple Joaquins who were named bandits at this time. So there was confusion as to which one of the stories was real. And also, when a particular Joaquin was caught, the person who caught him insisted that it was the infamous Joaquin Murrieta, although there's still speculation as to whether it was Joaquin Murrieta or just some other Joaquin that was the one that was caught. He raided ranches and towns until he was supposedly killed in an ambush. He was allegedly beheaded, and his head was displayed throughout the state as proof that such a legendary bandit had been caught. Among other bandits that the reading talked about was Joaquin Cortina in Texas and also Gregorio Cortez. But the common denominator for all of these stories is about men who are retaliating against injustices that were being experienced by themselves, their families, their communities, taking out their anger on Anglo property, often property that once upon a time had belonged to Mexican Americans themselves. But what this creates then is this idea that there is sort of this large population of Mexican bandits out there that then justifies groups like the Texas Rangers terrorizing Mexican families throughout the state of Texas. And the reading talked about some of these conditions in Texas, the constant violations against Mexican Americans where their lands are stolen, they're mistreated and discriminated against, and they experience overt violence, including lynchings. when Mexican Americans did protest their treatment by Anglos, they would experience even more violence as punishment for their quote unquote impudent attitude. As a response to the ongoing violence and the support of Texas Rangers in this violence, Nicasio Idar, along with others, organized the first Mexican Congress. In this meeting, they encouraged to resist Anglo incursions into their land. El Congreso also included radical thinkers and women who organized the Mexican Feminist League and took up the cause of education and literacy of Mexicans by opening up their own schools. Part of sort of a group that came from El Primer Congreso Mexicanista was the Mexican Feminist League, where Jovita Idar, who was Nicasio Idar's daughter, was the first president. And the reading mentions briefly Jovita Idar in her role, not just in this organizing, but also as a writer, as a newspaper writer. She was very vocal in the local Texas newspaper, critiquing the Texas Rangers for their violence against members of the community. And in the videos that I added for this week, there's a brief video about Jovita Idar and who she was and how influential she was during this time period. Now, another issue that is happening during this time period, as I mentioned before, was lynchings, particularly from the Texas Rangers. And I wanted to highlight this book called The Injustice Never Leaves You, Anti-Mexican Violence in Texas, where the author covers the history of anti-Mexican violence and the role of the Texas Rangers in particular, and covers quite a number of different incidences that happened from about 1900 to the mid-1920s. Sorry, that was my dog losing his mind. And I'm so sorry about that. I had to pause because he was barking too much. So as I was saying, the book does a great job at covering particular incidences that happen in Texas during this time period of lynching, but also really looks into how these incidences that happened in the early 1900s continue to impact those communities, continue to impact particularly the survivors, or the family members of those that were killed, and how that impacts generational memory, right? That these stories are passed on from family member to family member. And so you have these families that are carrying these histories that not a lot of people know about. And so what she did was just try to document not just these incidences that occurred, but also talk to those family members that are still around to talk about how it had impacted them. One of these was the Porvenir massacre in 1918 in Texas, where a group of Texas Rangers and US cavalry soldiers surrounded the town, took 15 men and boys to a nearby hill and shot them all. The excuse was that they were looking for Mexican bandits. And so again, this idea that gets developed of the Mexican bandit becomes the excuse to carry out this kind of violence. The sole survivor was Juan Flores, who was taken away from the group because of his young age, but he saw his father and the other men killed. He lived with the trauma of that day for the rest of his life and passed it on to the next generation. He would not talk about what had happened to him, but had nightmares, was very withdrawn from his children and grandchildren. And it wasn't until he was about 97 years old that he finally opened up to his family and told them what had happened to his father, what he had witnessed, and why he had nightmares and had been the way he had been his entire life, because basically he had been dealing with the trauma of this experience. And the link here takes you to a film. They have actually done a documentary about this incident. I was just going to show a particular clip. I will provide the link on the video page on Canvas to the whole movie. And if you choose to watch the whole movie and write a one-page paper, you can get extra credit for this as well. Now, despite all of these things that are happening, really in many ways to dissuade Mexican Americans from being vocal about their rights, but also from existing in the Southwest, these communities continue to carry on, they continue to arrive and create communities. And one of the things that they have to deal with, of course, is the pressure to Americanize. And the reading talked about the different ways in which Americanization was introduced and in some ways coerced onto the Mexican population during this time. Protestant churches saw the New Mexican population as targets for Americanization through their 100% American efforts, such as civic classes, language instruction, and home economics. Women in particular were targeted, since it was believed that if you Americanized the mother or the wife, you Americanized the family. So it was a particularly a gendered experience of Americanization. Employers also encouraged Americanization by requiring their workers to attend English and citizenship classes, and believed that an Americanized worker wouldn't join unions. So this was the incentive for employers to provide these kinds of this access to citizenship classes and English classes and so on. In schools, because of the biases of many of their teachers, Mexican American youth were tracked into vocational types of work. They were, in essence, Americanized and socialized into being low-wage laborers for American companies, which is why for many children, their education would stop at 8th grade. It wasn't seen as necessary to provide any further schooling to Mexican American children because they're just going to become farm workers, they're just going to become steel workers, and so on. So part of their Americanization experience was to be socialized into a particular kind of labor. Now, what we see is that regardless of all of these challenges, you see the increase of Mexican immigration to the Southwest during this time period, and the creation of their own neighborhoods that become known as Little Mexicos. This concentration of Mexican neighborhoods in certain parts of the cities where they were settling, like in Phoenix and Los Angeles. They created these neighborhoods to be close to wherever they worked. The living conditions in these places, which were really Mexican enclaves, included poor housing and sanitary conditions. But because of the discrimination they faced outside of these enclaves, they also provided services for each other through community networks and connections. Segregation also took place in education, where either specific Mexican schools were built closer to their neighborhoods or away from Anglo schools, or they were placed in a separate classroom within Anglo schools. And here in the image, you see children who are outside of a Mexican, quote unquote, Mexican school in Mexico in 1935. So this, image gives you an idea of separate, but certainly not equal kind of educational experience that the children are having. As manufacturing increased, particularly in the Midwest, companies actually put out calls for Mexican workers, resulting in the migration of Mexican Americans to cities like Chicago. So you begin to see these communities developing outside of the Southwest as well during this time period. Farm work also expanded into beet farms in Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, and Nebraska. So again, we get a wider view of where the Mexican population is settling throughout the United States, not just in the Southwest. Now, these communities, although they were segregated, they were poor, there was poor housing conditions, poor health conditions, and so on, they still facilitated the creation of what became known as mutualista organizations, which provided such benefits as life insurance, emergency loans, and burial insurance for its members. Many also promoted cultural connections to the Mexican culture. Other organizations supported workers in their efforts to gain better conditions in their workplaces. So even if unions weren't accepting Mexican laborers into their membership, mutualista organizations became another way for workers to organize and to try to get better conditions in their workplaces. These segregated neighborhoods also allowed for a small middle class of business owners catering to the needs of this community to rise. So, the person who cut your hair, the person who could sell baked goods, and so on. So you have to kind of see some of the pros and cons of these small communities and how they were created. One of the other things the reading talked about was the various organizations that were created during this time period, many of them across the Southwest, to address the needs, civil rights issues, and so on of the Mexican American community. One in particularly that I would like to highlight is LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, which was created in 1927. One, because of how distinct it was in its politics at the time, but also because this is an organization that still exists today. So this particular organization was unique in the fact that it promoted Americanization and Mexican American respectability. It promoted Americanization through their goals to develop within the members of our race the best loyal citizens of the United States of America. They thought that this approach would be the best way to be accepted into American society and avoid being discriminated against. So Americanization became a solution to discrimination. They also claimed English as the official language of the organization and used the argument that Mexicans had been classified as white to fight against Mexican segregation. So this was an organization that fought for citizenship rights, for better education for Mexican American students, but they saw that the best strategy to do that during this time period was to appear as American as possible. So that meant you had to only speak English, you had to be an American citizen to be part of the organization, and they supported anti-immigration laws to try to distinguish themselves from Mexican immigrants and all the negative stereotypes that were attached to Mexican immigrants. And we see after, as history moves on, that of course their politics end up changing. But we also have to think about why they did what they did during this time period, as whether we agree with it or not, as indicative of what they thought was the best strategy that they could use at the time to try to diminish the amount of violence and discrimination and so on that their communities were experiencing. Now, the other article talked about the experiences of women during this time period, and the gendered migration experiences that women experience. Now, the article begins with a narrative of a woman who leaves Mexico due to domestic abuse. So this is something that is rarely talked about, right? Typically, when we talk about immigration, the reasons given is either because of political situations in the countries they're coming from, or because of the economic situation. But for women, there's this additional reason for migrating, which is domestic abuse, right? They're fleeing the violence within their own homes. The image of the soldadera from the Mexican Revolution was another image that was upheld at this time for women, and the image there sort of captures who these women were. They were the wives of the revolutionaries, and they were responsible for domestic duties, but they also carried rifles, right? So the reading talked about the experience and image of this particular kind of icon, becomes kind of an icon. The reading also talked about the experiences of women migrating by themselves, single women or single mothers who came across the border, and we saw the different ways in which they were treated. Were assumed that they would become a quote unquote public charge if they didn't have husbands to provide for them. And this idea of potentially becoming a public charge was one idea that was used still to this day in terms of deciding who is allowed in, right? So if you are perceived, especially if you're a woman alone or a pregnant woman migrating, it is assumed that you're not going to be able to take care of yourself financially, and therefore you will become dependent on government assistance. We also saw how women responded to how they were treated during the border. I'm sorry, while they're trying to cross the border. So for example, there was a woman who was questioned about what she's hiding under her rebozo. And she was a pregnant woman, so she sort of, in a way, they're kind of using humor as a way to kind of call out the ignorance of the men who are the border agents at this time. There was also the example of the brother and sister, where she was more abrupt and aggressive towards her questioning than her brother, who was more accommodating. So again, these women weren't necessarily passive in the experiences that we're having at the border. The reading also talked about the complexities of extended family relationships, right? Where women relied on extended family to provide them a place to stay for them and their children when they crossed the border. But it also demonstrated how just because they were family members didn't mean that they weren't mistreated. So for instance, the author talks about how in some families, while the assistance is provided during harsh times, these were still stressful situations for many of the women. She also talked about the women's networks of Comadrasco, where women try to help each other, like the example of the woman who becomes a midwife. So there are varying experiences that are particular to women migrating during this time period to the United States. Women also participated in the labor force during this time out of necessity, going against the patriarchal wishes of their husbands, who had no other choice but to accept their wives working. Women worked in domestic work and industrial work as pecan shellers and garment workers. Others took on borders and offered domestic services from within their own homes. The reading also talked about the experiences that these women had by their employers. She discusses the kinds of work available to women, including domestic work, but also the mistreatment that they experienced by the white women in these households. For example, she gives the example of the woman domestic who received help from her employer to bury her baby when it died, only to later find out that this was in advance, she would have to pay back. Similar experiences we see by women working in the railroad or living in railroad communities, what are called boxcar communities. Women and children created gardens to supplement their food and income earned by their husbands on the railroads, and they also took in borders, sewing, and laundry to supplement their income. But part of the problem was that when they would have to leave, because it's a seasonal work, then all that work they'd put into their gardens and so on was basically left behind. The reading also talked about their double day experience of work, where Mexican-American women spent the day in the fields working, and then would have to come home to do the second shift of chores in the home, caring for their husbands and their children. And they also talked about the difficulties of motherhood and work for migrant women workers balancing work and motherhood, especially when there's the examples of women having to bring their young children into the fields while they're working, right? So they're mothering and working literally at the same time. At this time period, we also see some political gains made by some women like Adelina Otero Warren and Concha Ortiz y Pino, particularly in New Mexico. One of these examples is Adelina Otero Warren, who participated in the suffragist movement, seeking the right to vote for women. She won election as school superintendent in 1918 and ran for the U.S. House of Representatives in 1922. Her election was tarnished, however, by her own cousin, the former governor, where he reveals that she lied about her personal life She said publicly that she had been a widow, but was divorced from her husband, Rawson Warren. Of course, during this time period, a divorced woman, this is not something that is socially acceptable, and certainly not for public office. So she isn't able to win that particular election, but she continued to champion for education in her state. And it's also a little bit controversial. On the one hand, she was against bilingual education, but she was in favor of cultural affirmation and conservation, not just for New Mexico's Hispano heritage, but also for Native Americans, and was critical of Native American boarding schools. Concha Ortiz y Pino was the first woman to serve in a state legislature. She was also the youngest woman elected to state office in New Mexico. La Cruz Azul was a mutual aid type of organization for women linked to the national organization by the same name in Mexico. They conducted relief work with Hispanic communities, helped the aged with home care, raised money for the infirm unable to afford professional medical assistance, and offered aid in cases of community or family crisis. So we see that on the one hand, right, we have the experiences of women who are working as domestics, they're working in the agricultural fields, living in these rural communities, dealing with, spousal abuse, the difficulties of raising children in these conditions. Yet at the same time, there is also this other group of women who are middle class, they're educated, and are participating politically, but we specifically see this in the state of New Mexico. And of course, the last thing that's going on during this time period is World War I, which created employment opportunities for Mexican workers in areas such as meatpacking, steel, and auto manufacturing, which were better paid jobs with better working conditions. This also results in the movement of these workers into places like Chicago and Detroit and so on. The war also provided Mexican American men an opportunity to prove they belonged by serving in the war. However, many served in segregated units and experienced mistreatment by Anglo soldiers. The economic crisis that happens in 1920 to 21 results in Mexican Americans losing some of those nice jobs that they had gained before. We see the start of a pattern where Mexican laborers become scapegoats for economic crisis in the United States, and immigration restrictions arise and raids and deportations increase. So we see sort of this shift starting to happen during this time period that we will go further into in the next lecture when we talk about the Depression. So this ends the lecture for today. I will see you guys in the next lecture.